Yeah.
Okay, we're live. This is Senate Appropriations, May 27th.
8,200.
We're doing a bill. We're live. We're doing what bill? It says up there, 321. So we don't have legislators, but I don't think we've ever done this, but I guess Kirby can, I was wondering if we just do both at the same time, the fiscal note and the bill, but we could run through this, Kirby, run through the sections, and then Chris can go over the sections where there's money in it. But Kirby, if you don't mind taking the chair and then just giving us a, you know, almost kind of like just a section by section overview of what the bill does, and then we'll have JFO talk about the money.
Sure, I can do that. Kirby Keaton, Legislative Council. So I'll show you the Senate Finance Amendment, which is a strike all, and I'll try to flag for you any changes from the House or the Senate Economic Development versions. So in Section 1, there's an amendment that clarifies that law enforcement may seize cannabis that is illegal pursuant to administrative rule. This is products like synthetics. In Section 2, it permits the CCB to receive the 50-state fingerprint supported criminal history records from the FBI. Section 2A was added by the Senate Economic Development Committee. This starting next July, for the fiscal year starting then, would have 70% of the cannabis excise tax revenue be deposited with the Cannabis Regulation Fund for the CCB. Everything budget-wise has been done this year, so this change has to take place in the future.
So, Kirby, this doesn't commit the money; it just changes where it goes.
So you probably know there's been some changes the last 3 years. Just counting this, that would be the third change in 3 years. Starting this year, the 70% went to the general fund, and then it was appropriated for this year, the budget. This would change that so that it doesn't go to the general fund first, it goes straight to the Cannabis Regulation Fund next year.
For use running the cannabis program. Can you remind me the split between the excise tax? Are we in essence making a decision to commit all of the money into the cannabis program rather than say some other use?
That's what this would do, yeah. Well, the 30% that goes to misuse prevention would stay that way.
Right. So this basically takes all the money for cannabis off the table, puts it either in after school, substance misuse, or the cannabis school.
That's correct. Chris has a caveat.
Chris, with joint fiscal, there's one caveat in that further down in the language, you'll see that whatever the residual balance is in the regulation fund at the close of the fiscal year would then be transferred to the general fund.
Okay.
So it gets great.
So I can walk you through that when we go through the fiscal.
I'll be interested to know how much would, in a typical projection, go back to the general fund.
Stay tuned.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have an amendment that would affect this section, so we're going to talk about that.
The language that Chris was just talking about is right here in sub B below. So that's section 2A. And section 2B was a change from the Economic Development Committee to add a member to the Land Access Opportunity Board appointed by Migrant Justice. There were plans to possibly do more things with revenue in this bill relating to the LAOB. They're not in here anymore, so this is sort of a standalone.
Were they in there ever, or just talked about? Did some committee take it out? Or they just was never in there?
Economic Development had me draft something to look at, but they didn't. They didn't put it in.
Okay.
And the purpose of, in this particular case, one member from Migrant Justice versus some other entity is what?
This will be the 12th member of the LAOB.
So we're not seeing the whole membership here.
Right.
So I
I
think
could tell you the full membership if you want me to pull it up.
Is it online? I can look at it.
It's, if you could just pull up 10 VSA 325U. In section 3, we have an amendment that now we're going back to what was in the House version. An amendment that clarifies that hemp products deemed intoxicating by administrative rule are illegal in cannabis, not hemp. And so they would be regulated like cannabis, not hemp. Section 4 amends rulemaking authority for the CCB, doing 3 things. First, it requires rulemaking for governing licensee applications to change ownership, control, or location. Second, it directs the CCB to consider regional population and local input when issuing retail licenses, which is here. And last, it establishes some rulemaking authority over a new license type, which is, we'll see more of that in this language, but there's a proposed trim and harvest license in here. And so this relates to rulemaking for those services. Section 5, it allows the CCB to use a third-party background check company to satisfy the background check requirements in the case that the FBI does not allow the CCB access to the fingerprinting we were talking about before. In section 6, it removes the statutory requirement that the CCB issue a temporary employee card while it processes an employee ID application. It's here. In section 7, it allows the CCB to issue a temporary permit to operate a cannabis establishment in the event the owners of a license are unable to continue operation due to incapacity, insolvency, dysfunction, and abrupt closure. So just having some law to address basically the winding down of the business.
Can we stop there?
Yeah.
Can we go back up some time? So the board would step in to oversee a private cannabis establishment?
No, they would appoint someone or would allow a temporary permit to operate.
Why?
It wouldn't appoint, sorry.
I'm confused because we have what seems to me to be a glut of cannabis operators. That presumes a number of them are going to go out of business in order to reach a level, and maybe Pepper can speak to this, reach a level that is commensurate with the market. But why would we be in the business of trying to, is the idea that we're just going to wind them down, like sell all their stock? Why aren't they?
I think the idea is that they could be regulated while that's happening, and if the main operator disappeared for some reason, then there's a way to have someone fill in and wind that business down. And Pepper can definitely speak.
I'd love to hear more about that process.
Right now?
At the chair's pleasure.
Yeah, we can do that. Go ahead.
For the record, James Pepper, Chair of the CCB. One thing that we've seen in the past year, and this isn't exclusive to Vermont, this is all over the country, are businesses that need to cease operations immediately. Either, we had a situation where someone had their license revoked because of a separate criminal charge that you received. And then you have this, storefront with a bunch of cannabis that no one's allowed to kind of transact in or operate. And we have a one license per entity rule here, so no other business can just step in and kind of wind that business down safely. So, if this were a financial institution or some other kind of normal corporation, the judge might appoint a receiver, but that receiver isn't necessarily allowed to transact in cannabis. This gives us the authorization to give temporary authorization for a time limited period to wind down a business due to kind of death, incapacity, license revocation.
And the board would appoint somebody who's licensed to do it.
Well, not necessarily who's licensed. This would allow some, if the court through a receivership process decided that this law firm or this attorney is the best person to kind of wind down the business, allow us to authorize that person to actually wind it down.
Got it. Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
So in section 8, this section is part of the creation of the trim and harvest service license types and authorizes the license type to operate at multiple locations. So unlike other licensees, these businesses would be able to work in different places. There's the harvest license. What I was just saying there. In section 9, it requires cannabis packaging to include a harvested on date as well as a packaged on date. In section 10, it allows propagation cultivators, cannabis nursery licensees, to sell their seedlings to retailers who can register and sell them to home growers. A small change there. Section 11, this is part of creating the trim and harvest service license. Almost there. And in section 12, there are, this is the fee schedule section. This is where the Senate Economic Development Committee had changed some of the existing amounts for licenses, and the Senate Finance decided to change that back to the House version, undo those changes. And so you won't see that language here. The language that this relates to is what the House had done, which is create a $500 fee for the trim and harvest license, creates a 2-year option for employee ID cards, creates a 2-year option for product registrations for some products, and it eliminates the intent to apply fee that existed when this whole system was being set up before businesses actually operated. Senate Finance did add this section 12A to address some of the requests of the Senate Economic Development Committee. So we have subsection A here, which has the CCB take a look at the fee schedule to look at various parts of information about it, to review it, and to come back with recommendations about how that fee schedule could be adjusted. So rather than changing that fee schedule, they're just having the CCB look at it. And then in sub B here, they're having the CCB look at and recommend whether there should be any changes to how the excise tax revenue is used, and whether it should be allocated to the Cannabis Business Development Fund or the Vermont Land Access Opportunity Board.
So there are other proposed uses for that money. I'm worried that this language is foreclosing those proposed uses.
I think the idea here is the Economic Development Committee was interested in possibly using some of that for these 2 purposes here.
Yeah.
That's not being done in the bill, but they're having the CCB look at it. The language we looked at before about the 70% of revenue going to the Cannabis Regulation Fund would be a year out. So this report could come back and it could be changed later.
Right, but I'm not comfortable with the first piece.
Right.
And this, it seems to be, let's take all the money and use it for this purpose, and there were other uses on the table. So I'm just registering my objections to this bill making those appropriations decisions.
Well, they're not making appropriations, but this is a report.
Right, but I'm going back to the
Section 2A.
section 2, and then here it's basically saying they'll come back with recommendations about these 2 uses.
Right.
And so it seems to me when I read this language, they could recommend that it stay with the Cannabis Control Board, or that the money could go to these 2 options. So those 3 options are the only things contemplated by this language. And then we would have to start from scratch to undo them next year. That isn't my understanding of what this bill is doing. So.
Yeah, these are all things that, ideas originate out of Senate Economic Development.
Yeah.
Okay, so in section 13, this is a tax administration statute about transfers of businesses and tracking any trust tax, like sales tax, meals tax, that a business might owe when it's selling a business. And so there's some administrative provisions about that. And what this does is it just adds the cannabis excise tax to the underlying trust taxes, which this bulk sales statute applies. In section 13A, this is a request from the Department of Taxes for clarifying language around tobacco taxes, actually. Under current law, synthetic nicotine and what says here, the nicotine alkaloids, the nicotine analogs, are things that are considered subject to the tobacco products tax, the other tobacco taxes. This is clarifying language to kind of strengthen that argument up. It's really aiming at products like Zins, to make sure that there's not a possible legal argument for them to claim that the tobacco taxes, they're not subject to the tobacco taxes. So that's what this is about.
We should call them nicotine taxes. I think we had this language somewhere else. It was like it came up, there's been another bill.
It was in the GovRec language,
Okay.
and it came out and was put in this bill.
Okay.
House.
Yeah, I think it may have lived in the miscellaneous tax bill at one point that went nowhere.
Okay.
Section 14 deletes a reporting requirement of the state auditor relating to the organization of the Cannabis Control Board. Section 15 creates a full-time attorney position of the Cannabis Control Board for enforcement.
If I might, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Was that in our budget?
No.
So
So I also have an amendment to deal with this.
got it.
And section 15A is another addition from Senate Economic Development to allow for a pilot program for 5 cannabis showcase events. The CCB will be regulating these and granting licenses to conduct them. There wouldn't be any consumption of these events. It would just be about sales. And then 15B.
But it could be outdoors. It could have a farmer market feel to it, because some people talk about the section as a farmer market, but there's no sales.
No, I think there's sales, there's no consumption.
No
It's not
consumption.
like,
So there's
yeah.
sales, but it could look like a farmer's market, but it'll only be cannabis. It wouldn't be mixed in with other.
That's my understanding, but I would defer to the CCB if they have that idea.
Okay.
By the way, I inherited this from Michelle Childs, who's out. So
Okay.
if I look like I'm winging it, it's because I am. So section 15B is the retail sales report related to the pilot we were just looking at. And that's it. And so the effective dates, it'll all be effective July 1st this year, except for that section 2A we were talking about, which would be next July.
Okay. Any questions for Kirby? Yes, I don't know.
Yeah, Kirby, I just want to go back to the background check / fingerprints and so on and so forth. Who has to go? Is it board members? Is it licensed establishments applying for it, or is it all of the above? They have to go through the background and.
So yeah, my understanding is like a person applying for a license would have that, and I think the employees also have to have background checks. But
What about board members on this board?
The Cannabis Control Board,
Yeah.
defer to Pepper.
Yeah, I mean, we're state employees, we did whatever the traditional background check that HR does, whatever, before. I don't know if it's criminal or if it's just tax compliance, good standard tax firm, I'm really not sure. Certainly, I'm willing to submit to a background check, you know.
That's fine, that's not my question. I'm not singling out any individuals, what you've mentioned, other people coming onto the board. Okay, I mean.
Oh, no, that's a different board, sorry.
Yeah.
That section really is just kind of, it was a loose amendment that was hanging around from a different proposal. That's adding a new member to the Land Access Opportunity Board, not to the Cannabis Control Board.
Yes. There's not a strong tie between that Land Access Opportunity Board and this bill.
Or any.
The tie was really about possibly using excise tax revenue for that board. That's not in here though, and so the only thing that was left was that addition of a member to the land tax opportunity board. So it
Okay,
could be confusing because it's not related.
but they were, when they came in here on their budget, they requested that connection to the excise tax. Okay, we will have Mr. Root come up and go through the fiscal note, which is this a brand new fiscal note on the?
It was posted today.
Coming out of finance?
Good afternoon, everyone. Chris Root, Joint Fiscal. As I had just mentioned, we did post an updated fiscal note based on the bill as it came out of finance. Should be on the committee page under today's date, which I'm sharing here. I am a similar heir to this issue from another colleague. This is Ted's issue, so just like how Kirby inherited this from Michelle, I inherited this from Ted, so I am by no means our cannabis expert, but I will do my best to get back to you if you stump me with any of
We
your
all got the
questions.
fill, we have a fill in the system, we have a fill in George AFO, we have a fill in.
It's that part of the
I
session.
just noticed that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We
everyone's
need some
dropping
fill
like
in
flies.
senators.
And it shows you how deep our bench is.
Yeah, we got a good bench.
So there's a few areas of the bill that I wanted to drill into. I think Kirby gave an excellent overview of the major issues here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the fees because I know finance, it's a little bit more in their wheelhouse, but big picture, the fee changes that you see in this bill really aren't expected to have a significant fiscal impact to the Cannabis Regulation Fund. Some of these changes are, might impact the timing of fees by moving to like 2-year licenses instead of 1 year, but the same annual amount is prorated. The trim and harvest license, we were told that fewer than 10 establishments are expected to apply for that. So pretty small things. I really want to talk about a few areas of the bill that are really within the wheelhouse of appropriations. And I'm going to do the easiest one first, and that's the enforcement attorney position. That's we're told the annualized cost would be about $150,000 for that. The bill creates that position. It does not contain an appropriation to fund it. We were told that the FY26 appropriation in the budget for the board could support it, but that's a separate issue from whether or not you all want to create the position. So that's sort of one discrete thing in the bill that I just wanted to get off the top. The other things I wanted to mention, go back to Senator Baruth's question about 2A and the excise tax revenue construct. So as proposed in the bill beginning in FY27, the 70% of the excise tax, which is the 14% tax on cannabis, would propose to go to the regulation fund instead of the general fund. And that, if you're wondering, what are the other 30%? Well, that goes to the substance misuse prevention special fund that you all created in the budget. Big picture, these changes would be budget neutral, but they do have an impact in terms of like the order of operations and who gets funded and the flow of the money, who gets funded first. So I put a little table together here to try to explain it because it took me a little while to get my head around it. So we would expect, based on the consensus revenue forecast, that 70% of the excise tax would be about $16.4 million in FY27. So under current law, that money would go to the general fund. As you all know, the Cannabis Control Board, the revenues that come into the regulation fund are roughly $2.5 million a year, but the control board's budget is about $6.5 million a year. So there's a delta there of about $4 million that presumably would need to be funded from the general fund in FY27 unless you all decided otherwise. So you take that 16.4, you net out that $4 million that presumably would need to go to balance everything out to fully fund the CCB, and there would be $12.4 million remaining for the general fund from the excise tax. Under the proposed change, the 70% of the excise tax would go to the regulation fund, not to the general fund. Factor in the $2.5 million that goes into the regulation fund from the license fees and everything else. then subtract out the full $6.5 million to support the board's operations, and then you'd have about 12.4 million left on the bottom line of the regulation fund that would be available to be transferred to the general fund at the end of the fiscal year, similar to how the direct apps work with DFR and liquor and lottery. So it would be a current year transaction. So big picture, it would be sort of budget neutral.
What is the advantage of making the change then?
I'm not suggesting there is an advantage of making a change.
If
But-
it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, why aren't we staying with the status quo?
I think that is a great question to ask, and I do want to just pivot to one other thing that goes back to the piece about what you were mentioning around other proposals for the regulation fund and the report that was being required, is that anything that sort of gets funded through this construct, in a way, sort of gets funded before the general fund appropriation process. So something big picture just to keep in mind is, regardless of what the legislature decides to do with the remaining money from either the excise tax or the regulation fund, if you were to say, you know, the first $1 million left over in the regulation fund goes to A, B, or C priorities, that is essentially reducing the amount of revenue that would be available to you all to appropriate in the general fund. So I think you all have heard JFO's spiel about dedicating revenues, and there's a time and place. Think judiciously about it. The downside to doing it is you're essentially prioritizing certain things above everything else in the budget process.
Right, so, and Mr. Chair, if I could ask Pepper directly, I missed this discussion on economic development. What is their sense of why this would be a positive change? What do we get from going to this construct?
And the 70% going to the, so, for the record, James Pepper, Chair of this board. So that is how things have been essentially from the beginning, where you have to kind of go back to 2021 when the board was first seated. You asked us to kind of create a market structure that would be fully fee supported. So propose a fee schedule that would fund all the regulatory duties of the board, footprint of the board. You said in the kind of report point, if that's impossible, tell us kind of whether a portion of the excise tax should support the kind of delta between what the fees are bringing in and what the operating are. JFO, we submitted 2 fee proposals. One that fully funded the board's regulatory duties using fees, and one that created a much more accessible market that allowed the small local farmers to participate in it, because the fees are a lot lower on the small side, a lot higher on the bigger side, and that you would use a portion of the excise tax to fill the gap. And so that's the original structure that you created, but it was controversial at the time because nobody knew how many people were going to get in ever. You know, were the small local farmers actually going to kind of jump into the market or not? Because it's just going to be dominated by, 3 or 4 large, mega farms. So you put a sunset on that provision, the funding mechanism provision. You said in FY26, we're gonna start sending money directly to the general fund and reevaluate. Now we have market data. How many people got in? Were the fees set appropriately? What's the actual budget of the cannabis board? So honestly, this reversion is kind of maintaining the status quo. So the problem is that because that sunset was not dealt with last year, it was in law that joint fiscal office's consensus revenue forecasts anticipated money going directly into the general fund. So anytime you want to revert back to this, if you want to, that's the will of the committee, you kind of have to take it out versus you don't blow a hole in the revenue forecast.
So I'm just confused about the basic. So the way it stands now, the money flows where?
That is a surprisingly complicated question to answer. So in beginning in FY26, the excise tax goes to the general fund. But the budget you all passed actually carries forward a positive balance in the regulation fund from FY25 into FY26 to continue funding the CCB out of the regulation fund.
So there is enough money in the current budget to fund the CCB
For 26.
for 26, even if we don't enact this and the money flows to the general fund for the coming year.
I think you would need to make a decision about how you would fund the CCB in 27 and moving forward, but under status quo, presumably that delta would be funded by the general fund.
So is the rationale for this move, I'm guessing, but it seems like it's to allow the money to go into the regulation fund, cover all the expenses, so there's no delta, and then whatever is left after the expenses. And my question is, does that put the authority in the CCB to determine what are allowable expenses before they send it back to the general?
I believe, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you all would still reserve the right to appropriate the budget for the CCB. So you would be setting the budget every year for the CCB. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think that would be changing. You appropriate money from the special fund to support the CCB every year.
I guess I'm still not seeing why we need to do this.
And also it's for 2026. So the amendment in front of you that
Yeah,
Kirby drafted that I want to entertain and to have the committee think about to do,
just
Two
striking
things.
it out.
it would strike out that section. It's not taking effect till next year later. We could have the discussion next year as we discuss the whole budget.
Yeah, I would much prefer that because I feel as though this discussion did not include relevant stakeholders, and I don't want to at least even begin the process of committing that 70% elsewhere until we've had that larger discussion.
I agree.
Can you remind me on the 30% for the other pieces, after school?
And substance misuse,
After school gets the sales tax.
Correct.
they get 100%.
I get it. Did we at one point have a conversation about capping that number?
I believe statute caps it at up to $10 million a year.
That's what
We're
I
not, and nothing would change with that in here, and the forecast does not expect us to hit that cap.
Yeah, but where are we versus that cap?
There is every month we post the revenue tracker on the JFO website. and
70% is 16.5 million.
Yeah, right. So we're,
Add 30% to that.
So it's
I'm not sure I follow your math, but
Well, yeah, I mean, you don't know what the 30.
is it another 4 or 5 million? Are we halfway? Okay.
It's 16.4, 70% is what number? Like do 30% of that.
don't ask me to do math in public when I don't have numbers in front of me.
Yeah,
Well, I think to cut to the chase, I support the chair's amendment.
It's off the amendment, the second instance, it strikes out the position.
And the first strikes out 2A in its entirety. And so we would get rid of the 70% transfer.
And then we could talk about the position and the budget and how we want to do that next year as part of the overall budgeting and not try to get ahead of it.
Mr. Chair, I think Pepper wants to jump in.
Okay, I mean, I don't want to have a debate about it really, but I'm,
Well, I originally just gave you the history as to why this change happened. I think the rationale, to your point, is coming out of this pocket or this pocket, who cares? But really, I think the rationale here and the reason why almost every state operates with the kind of original structure before this, with cannabis excise tax supporting the board, is because, it's kind of a political challenge. Essentially, you have a lot of people that are paying into the general fund that never wanted a cannabis tax and regulated system. They're not shopping in any stores. They're not paying any, they're not benefiting from any of the work that we're doing under the regulation or oversight that we're providing to the industry. So, from a kind of optics point of view, wouldn't it be better to support the board's functions with A, the businesses that are paying fees, and B, the cannabis consumers that are paying for the excise tax? So that's the reason why a lot of the majority of the other states operate under create this regulation fund, put the excise tax into it, and whatever's left over send it to the general funds.
Right, but I do have questions. we're at the end of the process. As the chair says, we have next year to work this out. And I would hope it would be a broader discussion, because we've had several different discussions about, we've agreed that the after-school program, that was the governor's price for signing. So that got off the table. We've also agreed on substance misuse, because I think that's incumbent on us to run the program at all in good conscience. But we have always deferred the question of what happens to the money. I understand this isn't necessarily changing it, but it's beginning a process. It moves it to Cannabis Regulation Fund. Then elsewhere in the bill, there's this discussion of these two uses for the money. And I suppose at the root of it, I would like the Economic Development Committee to know that this is not a one committee discussion, and it had better be had among a broader group of stakeholders. So I support this amendment just as a way of leaving what needs to be done in the bill and deferring this discussion.
I would ask the question, through the whole setup of this thing, we have, the general fund has subsidized this whole effort up to this point. I have no clue of where we are in that process and in that piece. And if by setting up a separate fund for this, we set ourselves up for somebody to say, I want to rip that fund off instead of it going to the general fund. I want to be careful about that before we do.
Yes.
And I think it's also a precedent that we want to be careful of. Although we do have two other parts of government that do this, we don't want to have everybody saying they want revenue directed directly to them first.
Right.
But we, as kind of guardians of the general fund and deciding how it's spent, I think we want to make sure that it comes there and then we can look at all the priorities and then decide from that point.
Well, if the general fund has spent money setting this all up and doing all the work to get there, and then we just set ourselves up at the end of that, that we set a fund up so the general fund can get ripped off, I don't want to.
Right, and I think it goes to this large question of what the fees should be, as the history is like, should the fees be set to cover the costs? Or are we trying to do other policy goals with those fees? And that's an important discussion I think we have now that we're at a different part in history. I would rather have that all as one conversation. So I don't have any other problems with the rest of the bill, but these two, the position I think is premature at this point, and then also changing how the funding goes as far as the general fund and control fund is something I don't support. So if we have, is that a record of action? If the clerk willing to, we're going to say that Senator Baruth made the motion because we actually.
I do.
I heard that.
I will.
This is on your amendment.
Yeah, it's on my proposal for an amendment that would come from the committee. If it passes.
All right, amendment offered by Senator Perchlik on H321. Senator Norris. Not here. Senator Watson.
Yes.
Senator Baruch.
Yes.
Senator Lyons, not here. Senator Westman.
Yes.
Senator Brennan. Yes. Senator Perchlik.
Yes.
You want to leave it open or just let it 5-2?
I mean, he's in a conference committee.
All right.
Because I get the sense that, I don't know, he might like the amendment, but not the bill, but I'm not sure. So we'll just leave it open. I mean, we'll just put him as absent. He can vote.
Yeah.
No, he wants on the floor.
Yep. You want to report it?
Sure. So unless there's any questions about that, that concludes the action calendar for our committee today. And I'm not expecting any other bills. Are there any other bills headed appropriation wise that you guys know about?
Do you, this stage?
There are a few bills still out there. Okay,